Some Pokemon were so powerful and spammed by competitive players that they forced the developers to decide enough was enough. It was time to cut these Pokemon down to size with some big nerfs. But in trying to balance the game, they might have gone too far. This is the story of the top 5 most devastating nerfs in Pokemon, and we're starting off with a fan favorite whose devastation was not just a doozy, but a double whammy at that, and that is Greninja. In its Gen 6 debut, Greninja was a force. It warped the metagame around itself to what many top players considered an unhealthy degree through its extraordinary speed stat coupled with an uncanny level of power, stemming not from an outrageous special attack stat, but rather the fact that with its Protean ability, it changed types with each attack, meaning it got stab on everything. This already would have been overwhelming on a generic water type just packing Ice Beam and Hidden Power for coverage, but Greninja went gonzo with the other tremendous weapons in its arsenal. Dark Pulse ripped through the likes of Mew and Slowbro, while Extra Sentry shattered the otherwise perfect counter that was Thick Fat Mega Venusaur. As a bonus, Greninja got spikes, and every good player knows that stab spikes secretly do more damage than regular spikes. Just kidding. Though the real terror with spikes was how many switches Greninja forced, as it could now easily throw down a layer in spite of its frailty, which would allow it to overwhelm its counters even more easily in the long run. For such a fragile Pokemon holding Life Orb, it sure tended to stick around a while, certainly a lot more than the poster child for such a playstyle, Gen 4 Infernape. Also, the so-called stab spikes did actually come into play. If you attempted to level a slower electric move at Greninja, like Rotom Wash's Volt Switch as its spike, you would do worse than nothing as you thudded into its newfound ground typing. You just give it free spikes. It made for some nasty mind games. And all this was just X and Y. Once Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire came around, Greninja got Gunk Shot and Low Kick, which really pushed it out of control. Primarily because its one safe answer in X and Y had been Specially Defensive Clefable, who is immune to spikes and could take at least 2 Life Orb Hydro Pumps, no problem. But now it got absolutely obliterated by Gunk Shot. Greninja got banned almost immediately. Then Gen 7 came around, and Protean Greninja returned with a vengeance, now bolstered further by Z moves, letting it pull off insane tricks like Z-Dig turn Tectonic Rage to obliterate Magearna and Toxapex. But it got even better thanks to a new ability bestowed upon it, Battle Bond, which upon Greninja KOing an opponent, transformed it into Ash Greninja. If you could walk into battle with Ash Greninja already on your team, or if you could activate it automatically like a Mega Evolution, it would have been banned, with only the usual hesitation afforded to similar monstrosities like Aegislash, Genesect, and Landorus Incarnate, which by normal ban standards is lightning speed. Instead, Ash Greninja was basically a Mega Greninja you had to work for, but boy was it worth the effort. This was Greninja with a higher special attack than Kyogre and higher speed than Mewtwo, or by OU standards, the Tapu Koko that outsped it pre-transformation. Sure, Battle Bond meant you lost stab on everything, but newsflash, Water Dark is already an amazing, highly spammable stab combination, with choice specs attached, or the occasional Z Crystal, but mostly choice specs for the raw overwhelming power. Ash Greninja could threaten just about everything it needed between Dark Pulse and Hidden Power or Surf. As it did with its Protean variant, it excelled at throwing down spikes on the switch, and this made trying to save it off even more difficult. It became a frightening task considering the stakes of its potential transformation once you couldn't prevent it from grabbing that KO. And that's just 3 moves too. If you paired it with Spike's Ferrothorn, you could use Ice Beam on Greninja to really smack Tapu Bulu and Assault Vest Tangrowth, who were otherwise safe. You could also destroy a healthy Garchomp, or even Zygarde before it was banned. The 4th move slot though was dedicated to its incredible priority move, Water Shuriken, which hit 2 to 5 times at 15 base power in Greninja's base form, but it guaranteed 3 times at 20 base power after transforming, making for another incredible game-ending weapon. So where did it go wrong? Well, it skipped Gen 8, but upon Greninja's return in Gen 9, it was absolutely devastated because not one but both abilities it relied so heavily on had been gutted. Protean now only changed the user's type to that of the first move it chose upon switching in. Forget Omni Stab, the closest you get now is the threat of it when you've switched in and haven't actually selected it. Forget being able to threaten everything that switches into Greninja the way it was before. What about Battle Bond? Well, apparently Ash Greninja no longer exists. Now upon getting a KO, Greninja gains what is effectively a special Dragon Dance. Wow. Technically it also gains an attack boost, but that's worthless in practice. Anyway, this effect is obviously not bad. In fact, it's very good in and of itself. A special oriented Moxie with a speed boost attached? That's an excellent potential cleaning tool, but it's not nearly what Greninja needs at this state of the power creep game. To say nothing of how indescribably pale an imitation of its previous incarnation it is. Oh, and just in case you were thinking, that's still still sounds pretty decent, remember that Battle Bond is now a one-time effect. Forget the freedom of threat posed by a similar potential cleaner like Moxie Dragon Dance Gyarados or Beast Boost Scarf Kartana. Now if you want to sweep with Greninja late game, you get one shot, one opportunity. So good luck walking that tightrope with the precision demanded by its immense frailty and power that are no longer as impressive, without nearly sufficient a reward as compensation. Greninja is now in the tier below standard play UU, leaving one to wonder if that would be the case had Game Freak not had such a brutal, specific nerf intent when throwing it under the scalpel. Now, as bad as Greninja had it, at least it wasn't a box art legendary that had its status revoked. But before we get to that, here's a word from our sponsor, the GOAT, Surfshark VPN. A VPN or virtual private network is a server that you can connect to that encrypts not only your private data, but also your location. You can even use this to pretend like you're in another country. With streaming services like Netflix, you're often region locked from content. For example, I was vacationing in Canada and I wanted to watch Across the Spider-Verse, but it's actually not coming out in Canada until March 31st apparently. But with Surfshark, I just changed my IP to the United States and boom, I can watch Across the Spider-Verse instantly. You can do this with multiple countries because Surfshark has over 3,200 servers in over 100 countries. And of course, being a VPN, Surfshark keeps your outgoing data encrypted and safe. For example, I travel a decent amount, which means I'm often at the airport and need to use the Wi-Fi to keep track of my spending, because sometimes I go overboard on overpriced meals. But people on the public Wi-Fi at the airport could be lurking to access some of my sensitive data. But thanks to Surfshark, I just boot it up and my data is safe and secure. And one of the best features that separates Surfshark from the other VPNs is that you can use it on unlimited devices. That's right, no additional subscriptions required. You can put it on all of your devices. And there's no risk thanks to their 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you want a sick VPN and also support the channel to help us produce more content, you can click the link in the description below and go to surfshark.com/fallswipe for 4 extra months of Surfshark. And thank you so much to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring this video. And now our box art legendary. Zamazenta was already discussed for the Kyurem Black treatment in Gen 8, a cover legendary being brought down to the standard tier of OU, because for all its mighty base stat total and whatnot, it didn't actually seem like it would tower over standard play, at least not in the way you would expect. Some strong cases were made, including one by Joey Pokeaim himself, but ultimately, nothing came of the idea. After all, Zamazenta was still a hard-hitting fighting type, with speed that fly past just about everything not named Dragapult, and great bulk, especially on the physical side with the Eternal +1 boost that it received to its already handsome defense upon each switch in. So it didn't get body press yet, who cares? It was still going to get a lot of opportunities to switch in with that physical bulk and stealth rock resistance, then proceed to close combat most of the tier with ease. It doesn't seem that strong until you remember it's hitting as hard as the mighty Urshifu duo, and from a heck of a lot higher speed stat too. Sure, it didn't pack a secondary stab, but it still had no shortage of tools to threaten the daylights out of the tier's fighting resist. None of them were particularly comfortable switching into its many coverage options. Then Gen 9 came around, and Zamazenta famously joined OU, at least it wasn't in its debut generation, as it might very well have done so even without its nerfs. Scarlet and Violet's power creep is insane, but the nerfs were quite vicious. And yes, nerfs plural. What's particularly wild is that in Gen 9, Zamazenta actually received body press, but like Tyranitar receiving knockoff, it wasn't sufficient given what had been taken from it. First, say goodbye to Urshifu tier close combats, because that meaty 130 base attack got slashed all the way down to base 120. In an earlier generation, this still would have been quite good, especially with such an amazing speed stat, but in an OU tier populated by Great Tusk and Iron Valiant, stronger and easy to make faster as well, this was nothing. Second, Zamazenta lost its main claim to fame, its incredible physical bulk, at least after the first switch in, as that was the only time Dauntless Shield's defense boost would activate. Afterwards, Zamazenta was basically left without an ability. Not that the defense boost isn't extremely helpful the first time around, but it's used defensively and is far from a game breaker, unlike the booster energy photosynthesis and quark drives running around. Even if you take that boost further with the Iron Defense Body Press combo, you're not going to be thrashing entire teams on the spot. This isn't to say that Zamazenta isn't good in OU, as it's not just excellent, it's one of the most elite Pokemon in the tier, right up there with Controversy King Gambit. It's no accident that Zamazenta is one of the best King Gambit answers. However, that's just it. Zamazenta is considered close to the best Pokemon in OU, with its significantly slashed attack stat and no ability after the first switch in. This is why, in spite of such success, its nerfs are so devastating. Can you imagine how excellent it would be with a permanent +1 defense stat? What about if its close combats hit as hard as Valiant's and effectively as hard as Great Tusks? Either of these changes not taking place would be highly significant, let alone both of them. Zamazenta almost surely would have been tried either way, but it leaves one to wonder if it would have remained OU had it not had the hatchet taken to it, especially because it seems to be paying for Zacian's crimes rather than its own. But Zamazenta wasn't the only legendary Pokemon to be brought so low for the sins of another Pokemon. Just like our next Pokemon on this list, Darkrai. Darkrai, just like Zamazenta, is another longtime Uber that came down to OU in Gen 9. Also like Zamazenta, it did so in the wake of a major nerf. And also like Zamazenta, it wasn't really the impetus behind the nerf, but more on that soon. The fact of the matter is that Darkrai's devastating nerf didn't even come in Gen 9. It came in Gen 7. In Gens 4 to 6, Darkrai was the most powerful defining Pokemon in Ubers, and for all its threat level, this primarily was off the strength of Dark Void. It got to the point where a major Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire Ubers tournament was held with Darkrai banned because the player base thought so negatively of the dynamics surrounding attempting to deal with it, largely mirroring the growing acceptance in recent years of Sleep as a particularly absurd status. Darkrai's Sleep wasn't just fast and in service of a majorly threatening Pokemon, just getting the Sleep off already did damage thanks to Darkrai's Bad Dreams ability. Then in Generation 7, Dark Void got its accuracy shredded, going from a solid 80% to an unusable 50%, making it worse than the famously unreliable Hypnosis and its 60% accuracy. This in turn completely destroyed Darkrai's role in Ubers. Yeah, it was still fast and strong, but without the pseudo KO of Dark Void, which immediately allowed it to shut down just about anything slower than it, which at a base 125 speed stat that outruns Arceus is nearly everything. It couldn't keep up with the metagame at all, and you weren't gonna waste a slot for Darkrai to try and land Hypnosis, a move which famously makes Focus Blast look accurate. It was at this point that Darkrai was considered for a test in OU, though its incredible speed outrunning even Greninja, alongside Nasty Plot and the catastrophic power of Z-moves rightly prevented any such test considerators from materializing, as it would have shattered OU. Darkrai took Gen 8 off, then returned in Gen 9, where it came down to OU, but it did not do so quietly. In fact, Darkrai came down kicking and screaming as the player base attempted to wrest as much of its powerful sleeping antics as Hypnosis' appalling accuracy would allow. Strangely, Hypnosis' weakened accuracy actually made playing around Sleep more difficult. What if you tried to absorb the Sleep with one Pokemon and it missed? This is a burden that plagues Gen 3 players facing the much despised Hypnosis Gengar to this day, as the player base becomes increasingly aware of just how brutal and impactful free turn gaining tactics are. Sleep has come under greater fire, especially since so much of dealing with it is just praying for good RNG. First, Sleep as a whole was banned from Gen 5, funnily enough, a gen that started out with a fully fledged Dark Void Darkrai in OU. Shocker that it was banned so quickly, right? Then some years later, in spite of accuracy woes, Sleep was banned from Gen 9 as well. At this point, Darkrai without a Sleep move is a perfectly fine OU Pokemon, of course, and has been demonstrated over the course of Generation 9. But one of the reasons this nerf was so devastating is that had Dark Void not been nerfed into Oblivion, nobody would have dared to bring the terror warping Ubers into standard play. It was quite sad to see the mighty Darkrai flailing to hit Hypnosis in OU. The primary reason for this nerf being so devastating, though, was how it took one of Ubers' greatest and rendered it completely worthless. If you were on the side of Sleep being uncompetitive, you could see it as an overall positive, but Darkrai was at the pinnacle, only to viciously be thrown off. But wait, Darkrai wasn't the impetus behind Dark Void's nerf? How's that possible? As it's the only Pokemon to learn the move. Oh right, there's that other Pokemon that learns the move. Or rather, that learns every move. Yup, the distinction of ruining Dark Void went to Smeargle, which had been wielding Darkrai's signature move to wicked ends in VGC. While in singles, Smeargle puts opponents to sleep with the 100% accurate Spore. In doubles, it's willing to lose some accuracy in order to sleep both opponents. Sleep Claws? Oh, that's a thing from singles, yeah. That didn't get in the way. You know what else didn't get in the way? The grass types that were immune to Spore. There was no such equivalent to stand in the way of Dark Void, just a lot of Lumberries and even more Prayer. Darkrai as a mythical Pokemon had never been allowed in VGC, so players had been spared having to deal with its onslaught. But in 2016's restricted meta, Smeargle was among the most feared Pokemon in the format. Can you imagine trying to deal with the already terrifying Geomancy Xerneas when both of your Pokemon are under threat of sleep? Because that was a regular regular day at the office back then. It was so powerful and with so much RNG flying around that Game Freak saw it fit to take matters into their own hands and nerf the absolute daylights out of Dark Void. Smeargle would never see such tremendous heights in VGC again, meaning the nerf devastated it quite a bit. But then again, seeing as it learns every move in the game, it couldn't have happened to a Pokemon more capable of adapting. But that is the third reason why this nerf devastated Darkrai so much. It paid for Smeargle's crimes. Not only that, it did so pointlessly. Gen 7 saw Game Freak nerf Dark Void to 50% accuracy, yes, but they also made the move fail if it's not used by Darkrai. If they were willing to do that in order to circumvent the Smeargle issue, why did we need the accuracy nerf? Why Darkrai have to get caught in the crossfire? Did Game Freak have a vested interest in the health of the Ubers metagame? Doubtful. That's difficult to believe in the wake of Mega Rayquaza. This is a mystery neither David Lynch nor Scooby-Doo could solve. Whatever the case of its origin, the result is Darkrai's Uber status wrapped in plastic. But there is yet another dark type whose impact hit the world of competitive Pokemon even harder, and that is Tyranitar. There are many ways to describe the removal of Pursuit in singles from Tyranitar's move pool. One of the more interesting ways is to describe how, in the wake of no longer being able to utilize its greatest, most defining weapon, it wound up being completely unimpressive in Gen 9 upon gaining another incredible dark move. Tyranitar receiving knockoff in any previous generation would have had Pokemon audiences hooting and hollering at their screens like they were seeing the ending of the substance for the first time. However, in Gen 9, it was registered with a host of indifferent shrugs, so much so that for a time it found itself all the way down in RU. How could knockoff Tyranitar possibly impress modern OU? By still having Pursuit in its moveset, of course, which would have completely altered the modern competitive landscape into a dynamic more familiar to that of generations 2 through 7. A dark weakness is one of the worst things to have because it means you are probably at risk for having such a Pokemon forcibly removed from the game. Now a dark weakness is mostly just the cost of doing business for running busted ghost types, whose bustedness is largely in part due to the removal of Pursuit, meaning they were free to bludgeon and punish you with their incredibly spammable, nearly impossible to resist stab over and over and over. Previously, the words Specs Shadow Ball were almost unspeakably dirty. How could you just offer your Pokemon up on a platter like that? There were two exceptions. One, Gen 4 Rotom Wash, which would never click the move if there was even a slight chance of a Pursuit Tyranitar on the other team, and whose primary stab was Thunderbolt anyway. And two, Gen 7 Blacephalon, which was incredibly scary if it didn't face Tyranitar, but so haplessly ruined by Tyranitar that before each battle, its user had to pray each and every Arceus form they wouldn't face one. In spite of losing the move it had been synonymous for so long, one's weakness to Pursuit was measured by how vulnerable it was to Tyranitar, much more than any other user of the move. Tyranitar managed to bounce back in Gen 8, where its Choice Band set was one of the most ferocious wall breakers around, and if you gave even that Pursuit-less Tyranitar knockoff, you would have caused all sorts of chaos and destruction. And you certainly wouldn't have Tyranitar dip to UU for even a brief period, as it did. Even when Pursuit was a special move in Gens 2 and 3, Tyranitar still made it work, especially impressive given how much weaker the move was in the max stats realm of GSC, and how Pursuit was considered a waste on it for so long in Gen 3, yet it eventually became the standard set. The biggest drawback to running Dragon Dance Tyranitar in Gen 4 is that it means you can't run Pursuit on it, not because of viability, but because the moves are so incompatible. If people could run Dragon Dance Pursuit Tyranitar, they absolutely would. That is such a mind-boggling statement. Yet it is one of the many speaking to the incredible meta-warping power of Tyranitar's Pursuit specifically. All the rapid spinning and rapid spin blocking and dark weak threat spam and whatever revolves around the role Tyranitar's Pursuit played in it all, and how it shaped the most defining, powerful team styles and strategies generation after generation. It can best be summarized as such. You can pretty much divide competitive Pokemon standard metagame into three categories. Gen 1, the generations where Tyranitar has Pursuit, and the generations where it doesn't. It is a serious contender for the most devastating nerf on this list, but outrageously, it isn't, because no other Pokemon could be number one, and that Pokemon is Aegislash. Here we have the clear winner, not just in terms of how completely devastating the nerfs were, but how they apply to both singles and VGC alike. Now, we are fortunate to be in an enlightened age where people no longer pretend like Aegislash doesn't effectively have one of the most monstrous base stat totals in Pokemon history. We shudder to think of those dark days where people acted like it didn't have outrageous defenses and offenses at the same time, even though every battle it was in demonstrated that it functionally did. Then again, people also claim Aegislash wasn't that strong because Shadow Ball was only 80 base power, and Shadow Ball has become one of the most feared attacks in the game, so it really was a different time. Aegislash was untouchable as it threatened to lead Gen 6 into ruin before its ban, and Gen 7's Z-move power creep did just about nothing to quell the innate toxicity of its no-risk, huge reward playstyle in both singles and doubles. If anything, Z-moves just gave it another excellent weapon to wield. Anyone who followed the VGC scene during Aegislash's reign of terror remembers how often the commentators would be forced to say that it had stance danced back into its shield form, what with how riskless it was for the Aegislash user to make that move and have it be correct almost always, especially with King's Shield acting like some sort of mega protect that threatened to -2 the attack stat for any attacker that dared to make contact with it on that turn. There was very little one could do to prevent Aegislash from reaping the benefits of one of the most ridiculously effective type combinations on both offense and defense, alongside 4 stats on par with Kyogre's special attack, except this wasn't a Deoxys attack situation where both offenses were balanced out by frailty. No, quite the contrary. You couldn't even take advantage of Aegislash's bad speed because that bad speed was actually good for it. It was exactly what let it pull off this defense into offense dance in the first place. So what did the developers do? They made Aegislash a completely reasonable Pokemon, that's what. In singles and VGC alike. When you were originally one of the most unbelievably overpowered Pokemon ever, being nerfed to the point where you're fair and balanced is one of the most devastating blows you could receive. Game Freak took advantage of Aegislash's base 150 stats in both shield and blade form and sliced them down to base 140. Now, base 140 across the board is still pretty nuts, but it is a world of difference considering Aegislash's low HP stat. And you know what else happened? King's Shield now only dropped the attack from -2 to -1. Aegislash, previously renowned for having players absolutely beg for it to get sent to Ubers, found itself in UU. It was still a very good Pokemon, of course, but infinitely more palatable when its stats weren't so absurdly over the top. It was sent to the UU ban list, but it certainly wasn't OU anymore. And VGC-wise, it completely disappeared. Game Freak so thoroughly pulling the rug out on such a dominant force has unquestionably made Aegislash the recipient of the most devastating nerfs of all time, as it was the first Pokemon to ever have its base stats nerfed. And thank you so much to our platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Megamon VGC, Nurse Jake, Jack G, Pretzel SP, Soljiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu for their major support of our videos.